The sky over Kiev was a steely gray, the kind that presses down on the city like a weight, suffocating and relentless, as if the heavens themselves were conspiring to crush what little hope remained in the hearts of those who still dared to look upward. And the streets were quiet, yet the silence felt unnatural, tense, charged with the kind of fear that had become routine, a fear so deeply woven into the fabric of daily life that people had learned to wear it like a second skin, moving through their days with the hollow-eyed vigilance of those who know that at any moment the fragile veneer of normalcy could shatter into 1,000 deadly fragments. For months, Ukraine had lived in the shadow of drones that circled overhead like mechanical vultures, shelling that erupted without warning to tear through buildings and bodies alike, in the constant hum of mobilization that pulled fathers and sons from their families and sent them to front lines where death waited with patient indifference. Nights were spent shivering in unheated homes where frost crept across windows like skeletal fingers, and families huddled together under layers of threadbare blankets while cities bore the scars of conflict and collapsed facades and cratered streets in the haunted eyes of survivors who had witnessed horrors that no human should ever have to carry in their memory. But that morning, something different lingered in the air. Something that couldn't be seen or heard but could be felt in the tightness of every chest and the quickening of every pulse. A quiet, insidious tension that wasn't about bombs or bullets, but about words, promises, and ultimatums that carried the power to reshape the destiny of an entire nation in ways that might prove more devastating than any weapon ever could. And President Volodymyr Zelensky stood at the window of his office, staring across Kiev with a mix of exhaustion and resolve that had been etched into his features by sleepless nights and impossible decisions. His reflection in the glass showing a man who had aged years in mere months. And in his hands lay a 28-point peace plan, a proposal crafted by U.S. and Russian officials in rooms far from the suffering and death. A document that some saw as the path to ending the war and others as a capitulation that could fracture Ukraine's very soul and leave it vulnerable to predators who had already shown their willingness to devour whatever they could seize. And Zelensky rubbed his temples where a headache had taken permanent residence, because this wasn't a policy decision that could be analyzed with charts and statistics. It wasn't a tactical maneuver that could be wargamed on maps and computer screens. It was existential. It was about survival, dignity, and the future of a nation under siege. And every word in that document carried the weight of lives lost and lives yet to be lost. The weight of mothers who would never again hear their children's laughter, and soldiers who would return home in flag-draped coffins or not return at all. And the plan was staggering in its demands, almost breathtaking in its audacity, as Ukraine's military would be capped at 600,000 troops, a sharp reduction from its wartime strength that would leave the nation vulnerable and constrained, like a wolf with his teeth filed down, in certain territories, including Donetsk and Luhansk, where Ukrainian blood had soaked into the soil and Ukrainian flags had been raised by trembling hands, would be recognized as neutral or under Russian influence, while frozen lines in Kherson and Zaporizhzhia would be accepted as they were, as if the people living in those contested zones were merely pawns to be shuffled across a board by distant powers who would never face the consequences of their decisions. And Crimea, long a symbol of loss and resistance, a place that haunted Ukrainian dreams and fueled Ukrainian determination, was wrapped into the framework with language so vague it could mean anything or nothing. And NATO membership would be off the table forever, the alliance itself agreeing not to station troops on Ukrainian soil, leaving Ukraine isolated and exposed like a house with no locks on its doors in a neighborhood where thieves prowled freely. And on paper, the plan offered reliable security guarantees, but the fine print was murky and riddled with qualifications and escape clauses that any lawyer could exploit, leaving the crucial question unanswered and hanging in the air like a sword suspended by a thread. Would the U.S. and allies truly intervene if Russia violated the terms, or would they offer hollow condolences and strongly worded statements while Ukrainian cities burn once more? And the document promised reconstruction funds, Nearly $100 billion in frozen Russian assets that sounded generous until you considered the scale of destruction and the reality that money could rebuild structures but not lives. But it also suggested a gradual lifting of sanctions on Moscow, rewarding the aggressor even as victims still bled. And in short, it demanded far more than it offered, aligning disturbingly with many of Moscow's long-standing demands in ways that made Zelensky's stomach twist with a nausea that had nothing to do with physical illness and everything to do with the sickening realization that after all the sacrifice and suffering, the international order might be prepared to abandon Ukraine to expedience and compromise. And across the Atlantic, Donald Trump framed the plan as urgent and non-negotiable, his voice booming with the certainty of someone who had never had to watch his homeland torn apart or hold the hand of a dying soldier who whispered final words meant for a family that might already be dead. And a Thanksgiving deadline loomed like an executioner's appointment, November 27th, 2025, a date circled in red on calendars across Kiev, by which Zelensky was expected to sign. And on television, Trump's message was blunt and unadorned by diplomatic niceties. Accept now or continue the war alone. As if Ukraine's struggle for survival was an inconvenience that could be resolved by simple compliance. And behind the cameras, in the shadowy corridors where real power moved unseen, U.S. officials hinted with carefully chosen words and meaningful silences that military aid, intelligence sharing, and other crucial support could be at risk if Ukraine refused, the implication hanging heavy and threatening like a noose tightening incrementally. And Europe watched uneasily, leaders exchanging worried glances in Brussels and Paris and Berlin, for many had not been consulted, their opinions deemed unnecessary or inconvenient. And the consequences of ceding territory or constraining Ukraine's defense were frightening in ways that kept strategic planners awake at night, running scenarios that all ended badly. Because the specter of emboldened aggression loomed large, the knowledge that if aggression succeeded here, it would be replicated elsewhere. And whispers of betrayal stirred among diplomats who spoke in hushed tones about precedents being set and red lines being erased and the architecture of international security crumbling like a building with its foundation removed. And inside Kiev, Zelensky faced not just geopolitics with its abstract calculations and theoretical frameworks, but a moral and emotional battlefield where every decision drew blood from his own soul. Because thousands had died, their names carved into monuments and whispered in prayers and carried in the hearts of those who loved them. Families were shattered beyond any hope of repair, children orphaned, and parents left staring at photographs of young faces that would never age. Cities were ruined, reduced to rubble and memories. And soldiers had fought and bled for every inch of Ukrainian soil, crawling through mud and fire, watching comrades fall beside them, sustained only by the belief that their sacrifice meant something, that their nation would remain free and sovereign and worthy of the price they paid. And could he sign a deal that asked him to trade land for temporary peace? Could he look those soldiers in the eyes and tell them their sacrifice was being measured in diplomatic concessions and territorial adjustments? Could he betray the trust of a nation that had placed its fate in his hands and believed, against all evidence, that leadership could find a path through this nightmare? And every option was perilous, every choice a potential catastrophe waiting to unfold.
Because to refuse could mean losing critical support and continuing a brutal war through winter when heating was scarce and medical supplies were running low, and the will to fight, though strong, was not infinite. But to accept could mean undermining sovereignty in ways that would reverberate for generations, handing a moral victory to an aggressor who would surely interpret compromise as weakness and return for more when the moment was right. And meanwhile, Vladimir Putin watched cautiously from Moscow, his eyes cold and calculating as he studied the proposal that his negotiators had helped craft. Because the plan included almost everything the Kremlin had long demanded: territorial gains that could be presented to the Russian people as proof that the special military operation had achieved its objectives. Demilitarization that would leave Ukraine vulnerable to future pressure. A halt to NATO expansion that had been a Russian obsession for decades, yet it came with a twist that made Putin's advisors nervous. A U.S.-backed framework that Russia could not entirely control. Obligations and commitments that might constrain Moscow's freedom of action in ways that were difficult to predict. And accepting it could legitimize battlefield advances and allow Putin to claim victory, but it also tethered Moscow to Western powers in a way that was unprecedented and potentially dangerous, creating dependencies and exposures that could be exploited later. And European leaders remained deeply skeptical, their faces tight with worry during video conferences and emergency summits, fearing the deal would erode Ukraine's sovereignty and create a precedent that would haunt the continent, reward aggression, and send a message to other potential aggressors that patience and violence could yield territorial prizes and weaken the collective defense architecture that had kept Europe relatively peaceful for decades. And analysts warned in leaked memos and classified briefings that vague security guarantees might be unenforceable, nothing more than words on paper that would crumble the moment they were tested. And the legitimacy of a plan drawn up largely without Ukrainian input was dubious at best, a violation of the principle that nations should determine their own fate. And negotiations shifted like sand beneath the feet of diplomats who struggled to find solid ground. And in Switzerland, far from the front lines where death still reaped its harvest, talks reduced the 28-point plan to 19 points in meetings that stretched through the night, softening the most extreme territorial demands in language that was still subject to interpretation, and reaffirming Ukraine's right to decide on joining the EU and NATO in the future, though when that future might arrive and under what conditions remained mysteriously undefined. And security guarantees were revised to appear more robust, with additional clauses and commitments that looked impressive in official documents, though details remained unclear and loopholes were evident to anyone who read carefully. And Zelensky publicly expressed gratitude for the revised framework, his words carefully chosen for international consumption, thanking negotiators and emphasizing Ukraine's commitment to peace. But privately,
behind closed doors, where cameras couldn't reach and microphones couldn't record, he and his advisors ran simulations and risk assessments and worst-case scenarios, gaming out every possible consequence and examining every potential trap hidden in the diplomatic language. And the costs of refusal were stark and impossible to ignore. Continued war that would grind through the winter and into spring and perhaps beyond. More civilian deaths as missiles fell on apartment buildings and markets and hospitals. Energy shortages that would leave millions suffering in darkness and cold. Winter hardship that would test the endurance of even the most resilient population. And the costs of agreement were equally grave, perhaps even more so in their long-term implications. Compromised sovereignty that could never be fully restored. Moral compromise that would stain Ukraine's national identity, and the risk of emboldening an aggressor who would surely return for more once he had consolidated his gains and prepared for the next assault. And days passed like frozen hours, time moving with the strange distortion that occurs when every moment carries unbearable weight. And Kyiv's citizens were anxious, gathering in small groups to discuss rumors and parse official statements and share their fears. Soldiers remained alert yet weary, standing watch on contested front lines, where the enemy was sometimes visible across scarred landscapes. And the battlefield continued to shift with advances and retreats and skirmishes that claimed lives while diplomats debated in comfortable rooms miles away. And Russian forces pressed in contested areas, probing for weaknesses and testing resolve, even as their own negotiators spoke of peace. and protests erupted across Ukrainian cities, passionate and sometimes violent, with some demanding total freedom and complete victory regardless of cost, refusing to accept any compromise with an enemy that had committed atrocities, while others urged pragmatism and survival, arguing that perfect justice might mean national suicide and that the living had obligations to prevent more death. And Zelensky's mind was a whirlwind of strategy and empathy and dread, calculating military positions while remembering the faces of wounded soldiers he had visited in hospitals, weighing diplomatic advantages while hearing the voices of refugees who had lost everything. And he wondered, lying awake in the dark hours before dawn, whether any agreement could truly protect Ukraine's future, or was he steering the country toward a perilous limbo under the guise of peace, a twilight existence where sovereignty was theoretical but not real, where independence was proclaimed but not practiced, where Ukraine would be neither free nor conquered, but trapped in something worse than either. And the Thanksgiving deadline arrived with the inevitability of fate, the world expecting a decision, journalists stationed outside government buildings with cameras ready, and pundits preparing their analyses. But Kyiv remained silent. No announcement came, no statement was released, and instead, negotiators presented a revised framework that promised to fully uphold Ukrainian sovereignty, language that sounded definitive and reassuring. And on paper, it looked like progress, a diplomatic breakthrough that might save countless lives. But the devil was in the details that lawyers and analysts would parse for months. Were guarantees enforceable or merely aspirational? Would Russia truly honor a ceasefire or exploit a lull to consolidate gains and prepare for renewed aggression? How would reconstruction funds be controlled and distributed? And who would ensure they weren't used as political leverage to extract further concessions? And civilians trapped in contested zones continued to suffer in real time, even as diplomats celebrated their linguistic victories. A stark reminder that diplomacy was not measured in promises and protocols, but in lives saved or lost, in children who would grow up whole or traumatized, in futures that would unfold in freedom or repression. And as Zelensky prepared his next public address, sitting alone in his office with the speech draft before him, he reflected on the journey so far. Missile strikes that had come without warning in the middle of the night, brutal winters when fuel was scarce and hope was scarcer, unthinkable losses of people he had known and respected and loved.
All of which had brought him to this moment where the stakes were not only land or military strength, but the very identity of Ukraine, the soul of a nation that had endured centuries of conquest and occupation and had finally, briefly, tasted what it meant to be truly free. And signing a deal at the wrong time could leave the nation vulnerable for generations, creating weaknesses that future predators would exploit. But rejecting it outright could mean further bloodshed and isolation, the slow grinding down of a nation's will until resistance became impossible and surrender became inevitable. And the choice was agonizing, a weight that crushed his chest and made breathing difficult yet essential, unavoidable, his to make because leadership meant bearing burdens that no one should have to carry alone. And he rose from his chair, straightened his shoulders, took a deep breath that did nothing to calm the storm inside him, and addressed the nation with the calm determination that had defined him throughout the conflict, his voice steady even as his heart raced, his words clear even as his mind screamed with doubt, telling his people that Ukraine was ready to talk, but not at any cost, that peace must be real, enforceable, and morally just, that the country's dignity and the sacrifices of its people could not be bartered away lightly or traded for temporary respite that would ultimately prove more costly than continued resistance. And the world watched, holding its breath, as Kyiv navigated a fragile path between war and fragile, tentative hope, the outcome uncertain and the stakes immeasurable. Because for Zelensky, for Ukraine, this was never just about signing a piece of paper or reaching a diplomatic accommodation or satisfying international pressure. It was about survival in the deepest sense, about identity and culture and the right to exist as a free and sovereign people, and the unyielding spirit of a nation determined to defend its soul even if that defense required sacrifices that would echo through generations and pain that would never fully heal. And as the address ended and the cameras turned off and the world waited to see what would happen next, Zelensky stood alone once more at his window, looking out over a city that had endured so much, wondering whether he had found the right words, made the right choice, steered his nation toward salvation or toward a trap from which there would be no escape, and knowing that history would judge him, but that judgment was far less important than the lives of the people who depended on him. And in that moment, with the weight of nations pressing down upon his shoulders and the future hanging in perfect, terrifying balance, he understood that some decisions could never be right or wrong, only necessary, only human, only the best that could be done with impossible options in an impossible situation, where the only certainty was that whatever happened next would change everything forever.